At dawn on January 17, 1781, on an open cattle pasture in the South Carolina backcountry, hundreds of American militiamen fired into the advancing British line and then turned their backs and ran. Banastre Tarleton saw exactly what he expected. His infantry had marched through the night to catch Daniel Morgan. They were tired, but the enemy appeared to be collapsing. The riflemen had already fallen back. Now the militia were retreating. Tarleton drove his men forward before the Americans could escape. That decision would destroy his command in less than an hour. Tarleton had roughly 1,100 troops, British regulars, Loyalist infantry, cavalry, and 2 light guns. Morgan's army was similar in size, but only part of it consisted of trained Continentals. The rest were riflemen and militia, the kind of troops British bayonets had repeatedly sent running. But the retreat was not the failure of Morgan's plan. It was the plan. Morgan had arranged his force in 3 lines across a gentle rise. The first would strike and withdraw. The second would fire controlled volleys and withdraw. Only the third was expected to hold. Behind it, American cavalry waited. Tarleton believed he was watching an army disintegrate in stages. In reality, each retreat pulled his troops deeper into Morgan's position and closer to a counterattack they could not see. By the time the firing stopped, more than 800 of Tarleton's men would be killed, wounded, captured, or missing. He would escape with only a fraction of his force. Morgan would achieve it without fortifications, overwhelming numbers, or superior artillery. He would turn his army's most dangerous weakness into a weapon. How was that possible? By the end of 1780, Britain's southern campaign appeared to be working. Charleston had fallen, another American army had been shattered at Camden. British garrisons held key towns, while mobile columns hunted the remaining resistance. Then, Major General Nathaniel Greene took command of the broken Southern Army and divided it. One wing moved east with Greene, the other, under Morgan, moved west. Splitting an inferior army looked reckless, but it forced Cornwallis to answer 2 threats. If he concentrated against Greene, Morgan could attack British posts. If he pursued Morgan, Greene gained time to rebuild. Cornwallis sent Tarleton to destroy the western force before the wings could reunite. Tarleton was built for that mission. His command moved fast, found retreating enemies, and used cavalry to turn withdrawal into destruction. He did not need a long battle. He needed to catch Morgan moving. For days, Morgan retreated while Tarleton closed the distance, but militia on foot could not outrun British horsemen indefinitely. Winter roads narrowed the routes. Each mile increased the risk of Morgan's column being struck while marching. By January 16th, Morgan understood that continued retreat had become more dangerous than battle. So he stopped at the Cowpens. There were no trenches, walls, or heavy guns. The open pasture gave British infantry a direct approach and cavalry room. To Tarleton, it looked like the place where Morgan had finally run out of options. But Morgan was not searching for ground that would prevent retreat. He was searching for ground where he could control it. The open field let him watch every line. The shallow rise helped conceal the depth of his formation. Tarleton would have to pass through each American layer in sequence. The plan depended on one distinction: the difference between men who were running away and men who only appeared to be. If the militia fired too soon, their volleys would be wasted. If they stayed too long, British bayonets would catch them. If they withdrew in panic, they could break the Continental line from behind. If Tarleton paused to reorganize, the trap might never close. Morgan had built a system in which every unit had to retreat, hold, or strike at exactly the right moment. Now he had one night to make them understand it. By the time Morgan reached the Cowpens, the battle had already been shaped by a decision made weeks earlier. In December 1780, Nathaniel Greene arrived in the South to command what remained of the Continental Army. Charleston had fallen in May, taking more than 5,000 American troops with it. In August, Horatio Gates marched another army into Cornwallis at Camden and watched it collapse. Militia fled, regulars were cut apart, and organized resistance across the Carolinas seemed close to disappearing. Greene inherited roughly 1,400 men fit for duty. Many were hungry, unpaid, poorly armed, and exhausted. Years of raiding had stripped farms and damaged supply routes. A direct battle against Cornwallis would probably finish the destruction Camden had started. So Greene did something that appeared to make his weakness worse. He divided the army. Greene moved east toward Cheraw with one portion of the force. Morgan took roughly 600 men west into the backcountry. Conventional doctrine warned against splitting an inferior army before a stronger opponent. Cornwallis could concentrate against one wing, crush it, and then turn on the other. But that logic assumed he could ignore the wing he was not attacking. He could not. Morgan threatened British outposts in the west. Greene threatened communications and supplies farther east. If Cornwallis moved against Greene, Morgan remained free. If he turned against Morgan, Greene gained time. The divided American army forced the British to divide their attention. Cornwallis sent Banastre Tarleton west with roughly 1,100 men. That was not an irrational choice. Tarleton commanded the kind of force designed for this mission: infantry, cavalry, loyalist troops, and light artillery moving as one fast striking column. His method was simple: find a smaller enemy, close the distance, and attack before it could form properly. At Waxhaws, his troops had caught an American column before it reached safety and destroyed it. His cavalry had repeatedly turned withdrawal into panic by striking men already moving away. Against Morgan, that method made sense. Morgan's force included militia who could not outrun mounted troops. Every day of retreat increased fatigue and desertion. Every river crossing created a moment when infantry, horses, and baggage could become separated. Tarleton did not need a carefully prepared battle. He only needed to catch Morgan stretched across a road or trapped against a ford. Morgan moved north and east while Tarleton followed hard. The pursuit worked, but it imposed a cost. British infantry marched for long periods with little rest. Tarleton was gaining speed by spending the strength he would need when contact came. Still, Morgan was being driven toward the broad river. If the Americans reached the water at the wrong moment, the river could trap them more effectively than British infantry. By January 16th, Morgan no longer faced a choice between fighting and escaping. He faced a choice between fighting on ground he selected and being forced to fight during a retreat. He stopped at Hannah's Cowpens, an open grazing area used by local cattlemen. It offered no fortifications and little cover. The broad river remained behind the American position, making a broken retreat dangerous. To Tarleton, the position would look like proof that Morgan had run out of options: open ground, militia in the ranks, and limited room to escape. But the ground solved several problems for Morgan. The open pasture let him see troops who might disappear in woods. The gentle rise allowed him to place one formation behind another without exposing the full depth of the position. The distance between the lines gave withdrawing militia a route through the army instead of away from it. Morgan was not choosing ground where retreat was impossible. He was choosing ground where retreat had only one useful direction. As darkness settled on January 16th, Tarleton was still closing. Morgan now had to explain a plan that violated every instinct of men facing British bayonets. He would ask the militia to stand. Then he would order them to run. During the night of January 16th, Morgan moved from fire to fire across the American camp. He was making sure each man understood the few minutes for which he would be responsible. That mattered because Morgan did not command one uniform army. His frontier riflemen could hit officers beyond the reliable reach of a smoothbore musket, but their rifles loaded slowly and carried no bayonets. If British infantry reached them in formation, they could not hold. Andrew Pickens's militia included capable marksmen, but they were not trained to exchange volleys until a bayonet line reached them. At Camden, militia had fled early. The British expected it again. Behind them stood John Eager Howard's Continentals and experienced Virginia troops, the men Morgan trusted to face British regulars at close range. Beyond the crest waited William Washington's cavalry. A conventional commander might have mixed them together and hoped the regulars would steady the militia. Morgan separated them by function. The first line was a screen of roughly 150 selected riflemen. Their task was not to stop Tarleton. It was to make his approach expensive. They would fire at the leading ranks, target officers where possible, then withdraw before British infantry could close. About 150 yards behind them stood Pickens's militia. Morgan reduced their entire battle to 2 controlled volleys. He did not ask them to defeat regular infantry or survive a bayonet charge. They had to wait until the British entered effective range, aim, fire, reload, fire again, and then move behind Howard's line. That order removed the moment most likely to break them. Militiamen usually ran when they believed they had stayed too long. At Cowpens, withdrawal would not mean failure, it would mean their assignment was complete. But hundreds of men moving backward could still crash through the third line and turn a planned passage into a rout. Morgan therefore used the open pasture and the space between his formations. Pickens's men were not told to scatter into the woods or escape toward the river. They were to pass behind the main line, where officers could assemble them again. Howard's troops stood near the crest as the fixed point of the system. The riflemen could withdraw because Howard remained. The militia could withdraw because Howard remained. If the Continental line broke before the others cleared it, the design would collapse toward the broad river. Washington's cavalry formed the final layer. If British dragoons attacked the withdrawing militia, Washington could protect them. If Tarleton's infantry became disordered, the cavalry could strike a flank or rear. This was not simply 3 rows of men. It was a sequence. The riflemen would damage British control. The militia would add 2 concentrated volleys. Their withdrawal would encourage pursuit. The Continentals would receive an enemy already tired and stretched. The cavalry would attack only after the British had committed too deeply to turn cleanly. Each line surrendered ground, then transferred the battle to a stronger line behind it. Morgan was using distance as a weapon. Every withdrawal forced British officers to choose between stopping to restore order and pressing forward before the Americans escaped. Every visible retreat made the second choice more tempting. Tarleton still had to cooperate. He could halt after driving in the riflemen. He could deploy his guns, examine the slope, and rest his infantry. He could refuse to chase the militia and force Morgan to reveal the rest of the position. Then, before sunrise, American scouts reported that the British were close. Tarleton had marched hard through the night. His men were exhausted, but Morgan remained directly ahead. The trap had been built around a weakness in the American army. Now it depended on a strength in the British commander, his determination to attack before Morgan could escape. At dawn, British troops appeared on the Green River Road. Tarleton had awakened his column around 2 in the morning and driven it through cold, muddy darkness to catch Morgan before he could move again. His infantry was tired, and parts of the force were still forming as they reached the pasture. Tarleton attacked anyway. The decision was aggressive, but not irrational. Morgan was directly ahead. Reports suggested more Patriot militia might be approaching. Delay gave Morgan time to strengthen his position or escape. Speed had brought Tarleton this far. He intended to let Speed finish the job. He formed his infantry across the field, with 2 light guns near the center and mounted troops on the flanks. Then, the formation began moving uphill. Morgan's riflemen waited among scattered trees and folds in the ground. They could not stop a bayonet advance. Their rifles loaded slowly, and they carried no bayonets. They would have only a few shots before the British reached them. That was all Morgan required. Isolated cracks rolled across the pasture. The marksmen aimed at officers, sergeants, dragoons, and others visible near the front. The British line absorbed the fire and kept moving. That response pulled Tarleton into the first stage of the system. If he paused to reorganize, the Americans gained time. Instead, the pressure continued. The riflemen fired again, then withdrew toward Pickens's militia before British bayonets could reach them. They had not stopped the attack. They had removed leaders, disturbed the front ranks, and forced the British to cross the opening ground under fire. Now Tarleton could see the second line. Pickens's militia stood with muskets and rifles leveled. Howard's Continentals remained farther back, partly hidden by the rise. From the British position, the militia appeared to be the last fragile barrier before Morgan's army broke. The British closed the distance. Pickens's men held. This was the first moment the plan could have collapsed. They had to remain in place while professional infantry advanced with drums sounding, bayonets fixed, and cavalry moving at the edges. Fire too early, and the volley would lose force. Wait too long, and there would be no time to reload. The first volley struck at close range. Smoke covered the field. Men fell inside the British formation, but the survivors stepped around them and continued. Officers pushed the line through the gaps. Pickens's men reloaded. For several seconds, Morgan's plan depended on militia standing still while the enemy emerged through their own powder smoke. Then the second volley erupted. The casualties mattered, but so did the disruption. The British had crossed 2 firing zones without a real pause. Men had closed gaps, moved around bodies, and accelerated whenever the line ahead withdrew. The formation still moved forward, but it was no longer as clean as it had been at the start. Pickens ordered the retreat. Hundreds of militiamen turned toward Howard's position. To Tarleton, it looked like confirmation. The riflemen had vanished. Now the militia were running. The attack appeared to be breaking Morgan's force one layer at a time. To Morgan, this was the most dangerous transition on the field. A planned withdrawal could become a rout within seconds. British infantry was close behind, and Tarleton's dragoons moved to cut into the retreating men before they reached the third line. Militiamen dodged among the trees, using their rifles to ward off saber blows as the mounted pursuit closed. Then William Washington's cavalry appeared. His horsemen struck the scattered British dragoons before they could organize the pursuit. The clash gave Pickens's men time to pass behind Howard's Continentals. The second line had completed its task, but Tarleton's infantry kept coming through the smoke. The riflemen had retreated. The militia had retreated. 2 American lines had surrendered the ground in succession. Everything visible told the British that Morgan's army was collapsing. Only Howard's Continentals remained between them and victory. Howard's line waited behind the smoke. The riflemen had struck the British advance and withdrawn. Pickens's militia had delivered its volleys and passed through the main position. Now the battle had reached the one line that could no longer give ground without risking collapse. Tarleton's infantry came on believing the collapse had already begun. That belief changed the attack. Units that should have paused to restore spacing continued forward. Men stepped around the wounded, closed gaps and accelerated whenever another American formation disappeared over the rise. The British were still dangerous, but their advance was becoming less measured and more like a pursuit. Then Howard's Continentals fired. A coordinated volley tore into the leading ranks at close range. The British front staggered. For a moment, the momentum built across the first 2 American lines stopped against the third. But it did not break. Tarleton still had troops available, and Morgan's main infantry line was not wide. If the British could turn one flank, Howard would have to divide his fire or abandon the crest. The 71st Highlanders moved into the fight. Their advance threatened Howard's right. Morgan's formation had been built in depth, not width. Its layers could absorb a frontal assault, but they were vulnerable if British troops reached the side of the final line. Howard ordered the threatened flank to wheel and face them. The command was misunderstood. Instead of changing direction while holding position, part of the Continental line began to withdraw. The movement spread. Soon, the infantry on which every earlier withdrawal had depended was moving away from the British. This was not the retreat Morgan had planned. The riflemen and militia had withdrawn because their assignments were complete. Howard's regulars were supposed to remain and receive the main attack. If they broke, there was no 4th Infantry line behind them. Yet Howard could see one crucial difference. His men were moving, but they had not dissolved. They remained in ranks. Officers were still with them. The withdrawal was orderly enough to stop if the British did not strike first. Tarleton's men saw none of that. They had watched 3 American positions give way in sequence. The skirmishers had disappeared. The militia had retreated. Now the Continental line itself was pulling back. Everything visible confirmed the same conclusion. Morgan's army had finally broken. The British surged after it. British infantry pressed uphill with bayonets forward. Men who had crossed the pasture under rifle fire and 2 militia volleys abandoned what remained of their alignment. Those in the rear crowded behind troops slowing on the rising ground. Tarleton was not discarding discipline without reason. He was trying to finish the battle before Morgan could recover. A pause might allow the Americans to reform or escape. An immediate charge could turn withdrawal into rout and destroy the force Cornwallis had sent him to eliminate. The logic was sound. The information behind it was wrong. Howard's men had not scattered or thrown away their muskets. They were still close enough to obey an order. As they withdrew, the British compressed the distance while sacrificing the formation needed to exchange controlled volleys. Every step made the Americans look weaker. Every step made the British less prepared for what came next. Morgan rode toward the withdrawing Continentals. He did not need them to retake the lost ground. He needed them to stop long enough to turn around. Behind the British advance, Pickens's militia was no longer running. Officers were reforming men who had completed their assigned retreat. Washington's cavalry remained intact beyond the immediate fighting. Tarleton believed only one American line remained in front of him. He had not realized that the lines he had driven away were beginning to recover around him. Howard's Continentals continued several more paces down the slope. The British followed in a dense, accelerating mass. Then the order reached the American line to halt. Howard's Continentals stopped on the reverse slope. The British kept coming. They had crossed the pasture under rifle fire, pushed through 2 militia volleys, and watched every American formation ahead of them withdraw. Now the final line had turned its back. To the men at the front, the battle no longer looked contested. It looked finished. Then Howard's ranks faced about. At such short distance, there was almost no time to understand what had changed. One moment the British were pursuing. The next, a formed American line stood directly ahead with loaded muskets leveled across the slope. Howard gave the order. The volley struck at point-blank range. The British front stopped while the ranks behind continued moving. Files collided. Officers trying to restore alignment found themselves inside a mass organized for pursuit, not for receiving fire. Before they could recover, the Continentals lowered their bayonets and charged. For the first time that morning, Tarleton's infantry was being forced backward. Troops that had expected to cut down retreating Americans now had to defend themselves while crowded and exhausted. Then the formations they believed they had defeated returned. Pickens's militia had not fled. After passing behind Howard, officers had gathered them and moved them against the British flank. The withdrawal that had convinced Tarleton to accelerate now delivered armed men onto the side of his infantry. On the opposite flank, William Washington's cavalry moved in. Earlier, Washington had protected the militia from British dragoons. Now his horsemen struck the remaining mounted troops and drove toward the rear. This was the mechanism finally closing. Morgan's first 2 lines had pulled the British forward. Howard's accidental withdrawal had drawn them out of their last useful formation. The close-range volley stopped the pursuit. The bayonet charge fixed the British in place. Pickens and Washington attacked from directions the compressed line could no longer meet. Tarleton's force had not entered one hidden ambush. It had been stripped of cohesion in stages. The riflemen disrupted the front. The militia forced the infantry through casualties and smoke. Each retreat encouraged speed over control. Howard's turn transformed that speed into congestion. The flank attacks made recovery impossible. Some British units tried to face Pickens, others continued against Howard. Mounted troops searched for a route out, but every response exposed them to another American formation. Men near the center found Continentals in front and militia firing from the side. Those farther back saw cavalry crossing their route of advance. The attack became isolated groups. Then the surrenders began. British and Loyalist troops dropped their weapons when they could neither advance nor retreat as a formation. The 2 light guns were captured, along with colors, ammunition, horses, and hundreds of prisoners. Tarleton tried to recover the battle with the cavalry still available, but mounted troops could not rebuild an infantry line already surrounded. When the effort failed, he withdrew with the men who could still follow. Washington pursued. The 2 commanders came close enough to exchange blows before Tarleton escaped with a small remnant of his force. Behind him, the command sent to destroy Morgan had effectively ceased to exist. The fighting had lasted less than an hour. British losses were catastrophic, roughly 110 killed, more than 200 wounded, and over 600 captured or missing. American losses were far smaller, about 25 killed and 124 wounded. But the casualty list does not fully explain Cowpens. Morgan won because he controlled what the British believed they were seeing. The withdrawals were real. The militia's limitations were real. Tarleton only had to interpret familiar evidence in the familiar way. Every apparent British success made the next American action more dangerous. Now Morgan stood with hundreds of prisoners and wounded men. He had destroyed Tarleton's striking force, but Cornwallis's army remained close enough to retaliate. The tactical trap had closed. The strategic pursuit was about to begin. Morgan did not remain at Cowpens to celebrate. The field was covered with captured weapons, wounded men, and over 600 prisoners. Every prisoner slowed the column. Somewhere to the south, Cornwallis still commanded the main British army. Morgan began moving immediately. Cowpens had destroyed Tarleton's force, but it had also created a new danger. If Cornwallis caught Morgan before he rejoined Nathaniel Greene, the victory could still be reversed. Cornwallis chose pursuit. To move faster, he burned supplies and heavy equipment. The decision gave the British speed, but removed the margin that kept an army alive during a winter campaign. Cornwallis was turning his force into a weapon built for one purpose: catch the Americans before they crossed the Dan River. Greene understood the exchange. He reunited with Morgan, sent officers ahead to gather boats, and placed light troops under Otho Holland Williams between the main army and the British. Williams stayed close enough to draw Cornwallis forward, but far enough ahead to avoid being trapped. The chase crossed nearly 200 miles of North Carolina. Rain turned roads into mud. Creeks rose. British soldiers marched farther from reliable supplies, while the Americans moved toward boats already waiting at the river. Cornwallis accepted hunger and exhaustion because one interception could still destroy Greene's army. On February 14th, the Americans crossed the Dan into Virginia. Cornwallis reached the river too late. He had raced across an entire state, consumed his supplies, and exhausted his troops without forcing the battle he needed. Morgan had used retreat to pull Tarleton into tactical disorder. Greene had used retreat to pull Cornwallis away from his bases. The same mechanism had expanded from one pasture to an entire campaign. But Greene did not remain in Virginia. After resting and receiving reinforcements, he crossed back into North Carolina. By March, he had assembled roughly 4,400 men near Guilford Courthouse. Cornwallis attacked on March 15th with about 1,900 troops. Greene again used depth. Militia formed the forward lines, while Continental regulars waited behind them. The British forced their way through, but every stage cost men they could not easily replace. Greene eventually withdrew, leaving Cornwallis in possession of the field. Technically, Britain had won. Operationally, the victory was ruinous. Cornwallis lost more than 500 men, over a quarter of his army. Greene's force survived. Cornwallis held the ground, but could no longer continue on the same terms. He moved toward the coast, then into Virginia. Cowpens did not end the revolution by itself. The connection to Yorktown was a chain, not a single blow. Cowpens removed Tarleton's mobile striking force. The pursuit pulled Cornwallis away from secure support. Guilford Courthouse inflicted another level of losses. Cornwallis then moved into Virginia, where Washington and Rochambeau trapped his army at Yorktown, while the French fleet blocked escape by sea. The importance of Cowpens was not that one clever maneuver defeated the British Empire in a morning. It was that Morgan made British strength work against British control. Tarleton's speed prevented him from pausing. His confidence in the weakness of militia made each withdrawal look final. His determination to finish the fight stretched his infantry until momentum replaced formation. Morgan never asked his weakest troops to become regulars. He gave them a task they could complete. He did not stop the British from advancing. He controlled what they saw while they advanced. When they recognized the trap, the formations needed to escape it no longer existed. Cowpens was a system: visible weakness, controlled withdrawal, overextension, sudden reversal, and attack from multiple directions. Subscribe for more military history that explains the mechanism behind the victory, not just the names and dates. And tell us in the comments what truly decided Cowpens: Morgan's three-line formation, his realistic use of militia, or Tarleton's refusal to slow down once the Americans appeared to break.